Right. This video is going to talk about equilibrium in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. We've already had videos cover the aggregate demand curve and then the aggregate supply curves. We have a distinction between the short run and the long run in this model. So there's going to be a short run equilibrium and a long run equilibrium. So remember, the short run is that period of time in which some prices are fixed. And so the short run equilibrium is going to be the intersection of the aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve. And the long run is a period of time in which all prices are variable. And so long run equilibrium is going to be the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The reason why we have equilibrium here is really sort of the same, in some sense, the same kind of factors that we talked about with the supply and demand diagram. Equilibrium is going to be a price level at which the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. And so here we're talking about real output, not something like, corn. So it's going to be the amount of output that all of the different suppliers in the economy would like to supply at a given price level, and then the amount of output that consumers would like to buy, the amount of aggregate output consumers will want to buy at that price level. And because there's a difference between the short run aggregate supply curve and the long run aggregate supply curve, we'll end up getting these two different types of equilibrium. So what I've drawn here is an aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve. So we're ready to go with the short run equilibrium. The equilibrium is simply going to be, what we'll assume is that prices adjust so that the quantity demanded equals the short run aggregate quantity supplied. And so it's the intersection of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves there, as I've drawn. So then the price level there would be the short run price level, and the output here would be the short run level of output. And that would be a short run equilibrium. During this period of time in which some prices can't adjust, the economy would have a price level of PSR and an output level of YSR, wherever the aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply curves happen to intersect. Now, long run equilibrium, well, we have to have the intersection of the aggregate demand curve and the long run aggregate supply curve in there. I haven't drawn the long run aggregate supply curve in, but as we talked about in a video with aggregate supply, the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical at Y star, which is the full employment output level. So now I've drawn in the long run aggregate supply curve. And what we can see is the short run equilibrium that I've drawn here is not going to end up being a long run equilibrium, because the level of output, YSR, is not equal to Y star. In the long run, the output in the economy has to be Y star. Now, we said that the long run equilibrium is the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate and long run aggregate supply, and that occurs here in the economy. So and then the Y star, this will be the price equilibrium price level. This will be the level of real output in the economy. And the long run level of output is always going to be Y star. Now, how do we get from the short run equilibrium to the long run equilibrium in this case? Well, what we can see is that, well, first off, we know what the price level has to be for long run equilibrium. And one way to think about what's happening here is that this short run aggregate supply curve is based on the wrong prices. It is based on some prices have to be fixed in the short run. And the problem with SRAS, the first one that we have drawn here, is that the prices aren't fixed at the right level. They should, the wages, the menu cost, whatever prices have to be set for a while, whatever wages have to be set in advance, they should be set in this economy, given the aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply curve. They should be expecting the price level to be PLR. In effect, this short run aggregate supply curve would work if the aggregate demand curve would work to give us a long run equilibrium if aggregate demand happened to be going through at this point. So in effect, this short-run aggregate supply curve will be based on higher level of prices. So prices, the prices that wages and some prices, the level at which wages and some prices are set for this long short-run aggregate supply curve are too high. It should be, this would be the right supply curve for this level of prices, but we see that in this, given this aggregate demand curve, the price level has to be PLR. And so in effect, those prices that have been set have to be adjusted downward. So when menu costs allow those prices to be adjusted downward, or when the input prices can be adjusted downward as we go to this short run and long run, those prices will get adjusted downward. And in effect, what would happen is that this short run supply curve would shift. We'll call that 2. And one way to think about, these different short run aggregate supply curves is as if they're geared for a certain price level, the price level at which that short run aggregate supply curve intersects the long run aggregate supply curve. So in effect, the prices that are set and fixed with our first short run aggregate supply curve are too high, and they end up giving us a short run equilibrium where output is less than y star. The adjustment process to go from short run to long run equilibrium is those prices and wages that were set to be too high with SRAS1 end up getting adjusted downward until they're just set at the right level, PLR in this case, so that the short run aggregate supply curve intersects the aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply curve all at the same place. And then that would give us a long run equilibrium. One thing to note in this framework then is in the ADAS model is that any long run equilibrium must also be a short run equilibrium. But you can have a short run equilibrium that's not a long run equilibrium. That first short run equilibrium that I drew here is not a long run equilibrium. When it comes to thinking about recessions in this economy, recessions are going to be periods of time in which we have a short run equilibrium where output is less than the y star level. And so when we want to think about, we're building this model to understand fluctuations in the economy, or why you could have a recession, or why you could have output below the full employment level, which is then going to correspond with unemployment being above the full employment level, or we'll have some cyclical unemployment. And the way that occurs in the ADAS model is that you have a short run equilibrium. A recession is a short run equilibrium that's not a long run equilibrium, and it's a short run equilibrium with output less than y star. And so that is in effect how we are going to see or think about recessions using the ADAS model. Now, historically, there have been some theories of recessions that have been put forward that are different. There are different ways to try to think about recessions. John Maynard Keynes, a famous economist who wrote during the 1930s, trying to understand the Great Depression, really sort of viewed the Great Depression as being sort of a disequilibrium phenomenon, a case where the economy wasn't in equilibrium. In the modern ADAS model, we don't do that. We say that a recession would be a short-run equilibrium that is not a long-run equilibrium. And in some sense, then the ADAS model is self-righting. The economy will always right itself, because as the prices adjust, we'll eventually get back to a long-run equilibrium where output is at the full employment level. Now, I haven't said anything in here about how long this short run is, and that's one of the points of contention. And in one sense, there is no answer to give you here to say it's 12 months, it's 18 months, it's 6 months. We don't really know what it is, and there is a contention amongst economists whether the short run is a relatively short period of time or a relatively long period of time. That's one of the things that's discussed in Chapter 14. But what we can see is that in this model, which is the model we're using in this class to try to think about recessions are short-run equilibria that are not long-run equilibrium. So that's the idea of equilibrium in our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model.